Do we have Ron? Do we have the verdict? So I'm going to read this to you, Joyce. She was found guilty on 5 counts, not guilty on 1. I believe it's count 1, guilty, 3, 4, 5, and 6, not guilty on count 2. Does that surprise you based on what you know about the evidence and how long this jury deliberated?
So with your permission, Nicole, I'll take a look at my little cheat sheet on the indictment, which tells me that count 2 was the enticement of victim 1 to travel. And there had been some suggestion that this case in large part would turn on whether the jurors believed the victims. The defense tried to paint them out as people who had been willing participants and who were essentially participating in this case in an effort to make money or bring attention to themselves. But it seems clear that the jury rejected that because they convicted, according to what we're hearing, on the conspiracy count involving that victim, as well on the other counts. This is an enormous victory for the government, but far more importantly than that, this is a verdict that signifies that girls who are trafficked, girls who are groomed, girls who are criminally subjected to sex in this sort of manner can achieve vindication in court, that jurors will listen to their stories, and that more people who have been subjected to trafficking should feel confident that if they report what has happened to them to law enforcement, that they will be taken seriously and that their concerns will be heard.
So Ghislaine Maxwell, the breaking news, has been found guilty on 5 of the 6 charges she faced. They include conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors here they are. Count 3, conspiracy to transport a minor with the intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, transporting a minor with the intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and those 2 counts of perjury related to testimony in 2016, as well as conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors. Joyce, I wonder if you can speak to whether this has farther-reaching ramifications to sex trafficking prosecutions moving forward.
These are such difficult cases to bring for so many reasons. For a long time, prosecutors were required to rely on a law called the Mann Act. More recently, in the more serious counts of conviction that we see in this indictment, statutes that specifically apply to trafficking of minors were put in place to make it to give prosecutors, frankly, more tools to use to go after these sorts of criminals. And so what we can see is that the law here is responsive to the needs to protect people from predators and from traffickers. That there is the ability to reach back in time, because typically in a federal case, there's a 5-year statute of limitations. These charges, of course, are much older, and that's because Congress has abrogated that statute of limitations for crimes involving children and provided a much lengthier pullback that gives prosecutors the ability to charge these crimes after children who are victims come of age and are able to tell their stories and are more comfortable telling their stories. So this is certainly a victory in this individual case. This is some accountability for the victims in this case, but it also sends a larger message about the willingness of the Justice Department to take on sex trafficking, which can be a tough crime for state prosecutors to attack, because by its very nature, it often involves interstate travel, and that makes it difficult for a prosecutor in one state to go after all the aspects of these groups that are involved in it. It really requires federal involvement. These are difficult cases to bring. These prosecutors plowed through a lot of criticism early on in the case, where there was a lot of criticism of their early witnesses as being unprepared or not compelling. And so getting this verdict is a vindication for both these victims, but also for the larger work in this area of prosecuting trafficking.
You know, some of the victims courageously spoke out in a few interviews, and I wonder if you can speak to how a jury sort of receives that testimony, again, it was graphic, it was upsetting, it was painful. The Jeffrey Epstein, the sordid nature of his conduct and his abuse was something covered by journalists nationally and obviously locally for a long time. But talk about what these witnesses went through and how sort of re-traumatizing it likely was for them.
Because society stigmatizes people who have been victims of trafficking, just like victims in rape cases were stigmatized and still are to some extent for many years, these are some of the most difficult crimes for victims to take the stand and testify about. And a lot of the way the jury reacts, the tone is set by the judge. Judges are very aware of that, and judges do a really good job, in my view, in the overwhelming majority of these cases, of setting context for jurors about the evidence that they'll hear, about giving them a comfort level with handling it. But ultimately, it's up to the jurors themselves, and it's something that's very affirming about our system of justice, is to see a jury handling a difficult situation, evidence that can be very traumatic, victims who are all too often being re-traumatized when they're on the witness stand and subjected to both direct examination and also to cross-examination. And the ability of juries to review the evidence, to follow the instructions about the law in a dispassionate way in these very difficult situations, is something that has always affirmed to me that our system of justice really does work. You know, we talk a lot about its imperfections and its failures and the fact that our system of justice is aspirational. But this is something that we should feel good about, that these really difficult sorts of cases can be decided and handled by juries. And these victims, who my heart just goes out to as a prosecutor, every time you put a witness on a stand to testify to these sorts of very difficult facts, you understood that it came at a great cost to them, and you often had just remarkable appreciation of the emotional toll it took on them and their families. But this need to find justice, to hold these particular defendants accountable, and to create sort of a generalized deterrence that prevents these crimes in the future as people become more aware of the likelihood of conviction and the lengthy sentences people involved in these crimes face. This is such an important accomplishment.